For this final part, part 6, what I want to do is focus on the implications of this message that we've decoded here. And I want to focus on two aspects, the purely cinematic aspect in relation to The Shining and on the historical aspect. First, I want to go through the cinematic implications here. This message is a big deal because clearly Kubrick went through a lot of time and trouble in planning to construct this message. It would not be an exaggeration to say that this message is the centerpiece of the movie because, recall, it was the imagery related to the Rothschild family crest which led me to make the educated guess that that batch of letters that we saw way back in Table 2, that the family motto is contained within these letters. And also remember, all those references to the numbers 42 and 10 helped us make the connection between the so-called V line in the typewriter page with line 5 of page 132 of Catcher in the Rye. I would even go so far as to say that the real motivation for Kubrick to make this movie wasn't to make a horror movie per se, but the purpose was to blow the whistle on what happened at Taliesin. It was a vehicle for Kubrick to tell the truth about what really happened. What he's done here, it seems to me, is that he made this movie about a fictional family, the Torrances, staying at a haunted hotel, but that's really just a veneer of camouflage for him to tell a real horror story about a real event that took place at Taliesin. That might seem like an overstatement or hyperbole, but let me just relay this personal note here. When I was going through this process, I was expecting Kubrick to say something about the NASA Apollo moon project. There's a lot of speculation and rumors that he was involved with that in some way, and I think those rumors have some merit. And when I was looking at this table of letters, I was trying to look for words that would indicate something having to do with NASA, moon, or Apollo, and I was getting nowhere. In retrospect, I was making a fundamental mistake. I was projecting my expectations onto Kubrick's movie. I was projecting what I expected him to be saying, instead of focusing on the movie and thinking about what he was actually saying. And I can tell you, I remember vividly that once I started looking at this movie through the lens of the Rothschilds and Frank Lloyd Wright and the massacre at Taliesin, then I felt like I was really starting to pick up what Kubrick was laying down. And I would say from personal experience that if you want to really understand this movie, you need to educate yourselves about this Taliesin massacre, about Frank Lloyd Wright. And I think if you do, then you will come to the same conclusion I did, which is that The Shining is really about what happened at Taliesin. It's about what really happened at Shining Brow. Now what I want to do is focus on the Taliesin massacre as a historical event. And to get started with that, what I want to do is go back to the Charles Grady versus Delbert Grady issue. Recall that Stuart Ullman at the beginning of the movie referred to the caretaker as Charles Grady, but later on we find out his name was actually Delbert. And it was this discrepancy which encouraged us to focus on the name Delbert, and we discovered that the letters in Delbert could be rearranged into the phrase Red Belt. Now, the reverse is also true. That is, what I mean is that let's focus on Charles Grady. Keep in mind that Kubrick could have used any name he wanted. He could have used the name Edward or William or Robert, but he chose to use the name Charles, and we should ask ourselves, why did he use the name Charles? Now, if Delbert Red Belt Grady is associated with the House of Rothschild, then what about Charles Grady? what I'm getting at is, I think what Kubrick is doing here is he's trying to call attention to a Charles Rothschild. And so the question is, was there actually a Charles Rothschild? And if so, then was this person a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright? And it turns out that the answer to both of these questions is yes. There was a Nathaniel Charles Rothschild, and he was a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright. He went by the name Charles Rothschild mostly. And what's interesting is, when you look at this person, he committed suicide in 1923, and as you can see at the inquest of his death, in that red box there, it's not easy to make out, but apparently he made statements along the lines of "I am going mad," and witnesses testified that he would talk about hearing voices, and apparently there was insanity in the family. Furthermore, when you read various bios of his life, it turns out that he was interested very much in butterflies. He was an avid collector. He had a very large collection of butterflies. And when you keep this in mind, it's striking that in The Shining there are references to butterflies. As you can see there on the bottom, going from left to right, in the Torrance living quarters, there's a decorative butterfly display. And on the wall in the middle picture there, you can see that there's a picture of butterflies. And in the game room behind the ghostly twins is a poster which says "Ski Monarch," and monarch is a type of butterfly. So it would appear that Kubrick has called attention to this one particular Rothschild, Charles Rothschild, and it's the next natural step would be to examine his life and try to find some connection to Frank Lloyd Wright, or examine Frank Lloyd Wright's life and try to find some connection with Charles Rothschild. And I've attempted to do that, and I'm just going to say right up front that as for a motive for Charles Rothschild to strike out at Frank Lloyd Wright, I don't know. I can't find a motive. I've read many different accounts of the Taliesin massacre and a couple different biographies of Frank Lloyd Wright. I don't see any connection with either Charles Rothschild or the Rothschilds in general. But I would like to hazard a couple guesses here. Reading a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright, one thing did raise some alarm bells. After he returned from his tour in Europe, he got a very substantial endowment from a wealthy benefactor named Darwin Martin, $25,000, which was really a large amount of money back then. Now, Darwin Martin genuinely liked Frank Lloyd Wright. Apparently Frank Lloyd Wright designed his estate, but Martin did disapprove of Frank Lloyd Wright's relationship with Mamah. Wright was still married to his first wife at the time, and apparently this Darwin Martin fella didn't like that. What I mean is, he disapproved of his relationship with Mamah. Now, from what I could gather, Frank Lloyd Wright basically misrepresented his intention to Martin. He told Martin that his relationship with Mamah was over, and he was going to use the money to build a house for his mother. But that wasn't true. He had no intention of leaving Mamah, and he used the money to build Taliesin for himself and Mamah. Now, I want to say up front that by all accounts, Martin genuinely admired Frank Lloyd Wright, and I don't think that he would have done anything to harm him. However, I would like to consider the possibility that the money ultimately didn't come from Darwin Martin. What if the money actually ultimately came from Charles Rothschild, and Darwin Martin was more of an intermediary or a conduit for that money? Now, if that's true, then one possible scenario is that Charles Rothschild, being insane, reacted to this deception on the part of Frank Lloyd Wright violently, and instead of seeking some sort of legal recourse for breach of contract or whatever, he used his wealth and influence to carry out the Taliesin massacre. Another possibility I want to consider has to do with Frank Lloyd Wright's political beliefs. At this point in time, World War I was approaching, and wealthy bankers like the Rothschilds make a lot of money off of war profiteering, and America's entry into World War I would have clearly been in their financial interest. Now, the problem from the Rothschilds' point of view is that the Americans in general didn't want to have anything to do with this European war, and Frank Lloyd Wright in particular would have been a potential problem because he was a pacifist and he was staunchly anti-war. Furthermore, after his tour in Europe, he became an internationally celebrated architect, and that may have given him an influential position politically in tipping the balance toward keeping America out of World War I. So my second theory as to Charles Rothschild's motive for the Taliesin massacre goes as follows. Again, keeping in mind that he was insane, the attack on Taliesin was intended as a message to Frank Lloyd Wright to keep his anti-war sentiments to himself and basically neutralize him as a political obstacle towards America's entry into World War I. So those are my two theories, and I want to admit right up front that I don't find them particularly strong or convincing, but it's the best I can do. Now, just because I'm unable to make a really strong case for a motive doesn't mean that there wasn't one. It just means that I don't have the means or the ability or the resources to ferret out this motive. But having said that, we do have this message that Kubrick used in conjunction with The Catcher in the Rye to tell us that the Rothschilds had something to do with the Taliesin massacre. And I believe the message is valid, obviously, or I wouldn't have made these videos in the first place. And accordingly, I think there's a real opportunity here if you happen to be a serious student of Frank Lloyd Wright, if you're familiar with his archive of letters and journals and correspondence and financial records or whatever, then there may very well be a really big opportunity here to make a name for yourself. As for me, I've concluded that this mysterious motive is just not in the public domain, and so I'm just going to have to leave it to somebody else to discover. From my point of view, I believe that I trust Stanley Kubrick. I believe that this message that he created is legitimate, and so from what I'm going to do from here on out is I'm going to assume that Charles Rothschild, or the Rothschilds in general, had something to do with the Taliesin massacre. So with that, I want to look at some suspicious aspects to this event. Recall that the official story to this event would have us believe that Julian Carleton acted alone. Also remember, he was a handyman there working at the time at Taliesin. Julian had a wife whose name was Gertrude, and she was living with him at Taliesin, and she was there when the attack took place. At a preliminary hearing a couple days after the attack, she allegedly gave statements intimating that her husband was insane. And on the surface, this would tend to support the idea that Carleton just simply went crazy, and that's the reason why he did what he did. But I want to point out that this information about Gertrude and her statements came from a Chicago Tribune article. And in that same article, there were a couple other significant points that turned out to not be true. He was described as being squat, but that's not an accurate physical description of him. And more importantly, apparently Gertrude was allegedly said that Julian Carleton worked as a Pullman porter, but that's not true either. And furthermore, there was another press account that had her made the following statements that you can see in green there in bullet point number 4. I didn't make that up. That was apparently an actual that actually appeared in an article. Now, I don't find that statement there to be credible at all. That strikes me as something that was just fabricated. And that seems to be a common theme regarding the press in relation to the Taliesin massacre. The press got a lot of things wrong, and you can check into that yourself in the book Plagued by Fire, which has a really good account of this event in Frank Lloyd Wright's life. And with these things in mind, I really want to point out that it seems that the vast majority of what we know about what Gertrude Carlton had to say about the Taliesin massacre comes from press statements. It comes from articles in newspapers, which may or may not be accurate. And what I find striking is there doesn't seem to be, I guess, what I would regard as official transcripts or narratives of Gertrude Carlton answering questions, for example, from a prosecutor or some sort of law enforcement investigators. And what is also striking is that a couple weeks after she was taken into custody, she was put on a train to Chicago, and she was never seen or heard from again. When you think about this, this is really astonishing. Gertrude Carlton was a potentially very important witness. She could have shed light on Julian Carlton's, not only his motive, but how exactly he managed to kill so many people who were separated by a significant distance. So, a potentially crucial witness to the worst incident of mass murder in Wisconsin state history is not merely let go. She is actually put on a train leaving the state. I just don't understand how something like this could happen. And I would go so far as to say that it's a giant red flag indicating that there's something really fishy going on here. Next, I would like to turn my attention to how Julian Carlton was treated. Recall that before he was taken into custody, he allegedly drank acid in an attempt to commit suicide. This inhibited his ability to speak and eat, and as you can see from this timeline here, over the course of the 50 some odd days he was in custody, it was clear that his health was deteriorating severely. Now, keep in mind, he was being held in a small jail cell in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and clearly this jail was not equipped to deal with his deteriorating health. As a consequence, Carlton eventually died of starvation or malnutrition on October 7th. I think it's entirely reasonable to ask the question, why wasn't more effort expended to keep Carlton alive? How difficult would it have been to transfer him to a state prison or some facility that had a medical wing where he could receive better medical care? Now, it's entirely possible that Carlton's health was such that no amount of medical attention could have saved him. But the point is, there seems to have been a real lack of effort to prevent his eventual death before he could stand trial. Now, the reason I wanted to focus on Julian and Gertrude Carlton is because when you take a skeptical attitude towards the accepted narrative of the Taliesin massacre, that is, you're actively questioning aspects of this event that don't seem right, then the way these two people were treated, I think, is indicative of something being very, very off here. And I think there are at least two distinct possibilities. I'm sure there are probably more, but to simplify things, I want to condense things down into these two possibilities. The first possibility being just pure incompetence. Their rank incompetence resulted in a potentially key witness being put on a train leaving the state, with the result being that she was never seen or heard from again. And they were apparently too dumb to think of taking some rudimentary steps to keep the prime suspect alive long enough to stand trial. The other possibility is corruption. That is, they intentionally let Gertrude Carlton go because they didn't want her to say anything that might reveal something that they wanted to hide. And they let Julian Carlton starve to death so that there wouldn't be a trial. And the reason they did these things is because they were acting on behalf of some third party that were influencing them or bribing them in some way. A lot of people instinctively shy away from conspiracy theories, but in this case I think we are entitled to give this angle a good look, for the simple reason that we have Stanley Kubrick's message. We have a message from Stanley Kubrick telling us that some very wealthy and powerful people were involved in this event in some way. And while I've said before that a motive for the Rothschilds to carry this out, this Taliesin massacre, is unclear, if we assume that they did, and if we assume that is that they were behind this, then it does have some advantages, and the first thing we can focus on is Julian Carlton's motive. We can conclude that Julian Carlton did what he did for money, and it's a sad fact that a lot of people will do some horrible things for the right price, but that's just a fact, and when you think about it, it's fairly simple and straightforward. Julian Carlton did what he did at Taliesin because somebody paid him to do it. Taking a conspiratorial approach here also has another advantage, and that has to do with how Julian Carlton did what he did. Recall that one of the puzzling aspects to this event was how did Julian Carlton manage to kill so many people who were separated by a significant distance? Well, we can now theorize that Julian Carlton had an accomplice. When trying to determine who may have helped Carlton, I want to point out that there were two survivors to the Taliesin massacre. One was William Weston, who was a carpenter, and the other was Herbert Fritz, a draftsman. And I think that Herbert Fritz is the better candidate of the two for the following reasons. The first reason is that William Weston had a son there at Taliesin the day of the attack who was killed, a 13-year-old boy. So I think that makes it highly unlikely that he would have had anything to do with it. But the other reason is, when you look at the recollections between these two men, Herbert Fritz gives much more detail to what happened. And actually, it is from Fritz where we get a lot of the accepted narrative that has come down to us through the years. And if you take the position that the accepted narrative is false, then it's reasonable to look at Herbert Fritz's narrative as being false as well. Or in other words, there's a distinct possibility that Herbert Fritz lied about what happened that day. Just so you can see for yourself, what I have here is Herbert Fritz's account. This is coming from the book Death in a Prairie House. There's quite a bit there, so if you want to pause and read it for yourself, you can do so. What I want to do now is show you a floor plan of the Taliesin compound, showing where the victims were located when the attack occurred. And you can see that Mema and her two kids were in a patio area in the upper left, and in the lower right the men were eating lunch in a dining room area there again on the lower right. So Carlton allegedly killed Mema and her two kids. Then he went over to the dining room area. He poured gasoline under the door, set it on fire, and he attacked the men who were frantically trying to get out. And he was attacking men as they were trying to get out that door there, and he was also attacking other men as they were trying to get out of the window to the garden area. So you can see that why so many people have been puzzled as to how Julian Carlton could have done this all by himself. And by the way, I said that Carlton attacked Mima and her kids first, but that's not at all certain. He could have attacked the men in the dining room first, or he could have done something in between. Like, for example, he could have started the fire, run over and killed Mima and her kids, and then run back and attack the men. There are several different scenarios you could play with, but the fact is, whatever scenario you decide upon, it's still very striking that Carlton would have been able to do all of this carnage all by himself. However, if we assume that Carlton and Fritz were accomplices, then we have something a little bit more reasonable to consider, and that is two assailants attacking two separate groups. Now, we know from William Weston's account that he was attacked by Carlton. So that means that Herbert Fritz would have been the one to have attacked Mima and her kids. So the scenario that I've mapped out here is as follows. Herbert Fritz knows what's going to happen, so he positions himself next to the window leading out to the garden area. Julian Carlton pours gasoline under the door and sets it on fire. As soon as that happens, Fritz jumps out of that window and runs over and attacks Mima and her kids, killing them. And while he's doing that, Carlton is attacking the men in the dining room. Now, if you're focusing only on the Taliesin massacre itself, from a practical point of view, I think this is a better scenario than the Julian Carlton acted alone scenario. But it does have, I think, one big disadvantage, and I'm sure you could probably think of other disadvantages. The one disadvantage it has to do with the fact that Carlton was taken into custody, but Fritz wasn't, and that would indicate that, to me anyway, that Carlton was being set up as the fall guy. And so the question is, why didn't Carlton say something about that? Why didn't he try to blow the whistle if there was in fact a conspiracy? And I admittedly don't really have a good explanation for that. I do want to point out that he did supposedly ingest acid, whether voluntarily or not is unknown, and that inhibited his ability to speak. But we also have to keep in mind that while he was being incarcerated in the Dodgeville jail, he would have been at the complete mercy of the Iowa County authorities, who I think may very well have been part of this conspiracy. In any event, getting back to Herbert Fritz, I did make an effort to try and research the life of this person, and I have to say that I find it odd that I was basically able to come up with nothing. I could not come up with any information as to how he got the position he did at Taliesin. Where did he go after he left Taliesin? Was there any indication that he was spending large amounts of money after the Taliesin massacre? I can't find a picture of him, and obviously I don't know if there's any connection between him and the Rothschilds. And as I said before, I think that's very odd, because this was a major event in the life of one of the preeminent architects of the 20th century, and I would have thought that people would have sought him out over the years to interview him, to ask him about what happened, what he saw, and there's just nothing out there. At least I should say, I can't. If there is, I can't find it. So, if you think there's something to this theory of mine that Fritz had something to do with this massacre, then I invite you to look for yourself. And so with these unanswered questions, I find that I've reached the end of the road here. I don't really have anything more to add, so I'll sign off at this point. I do hope that you've found this whole exercise here thought-provoking at the least, and maybe some of you will be inspired to look into this subject yourselves, and maybe someday we'll figure out what really happened at Taliesin. If we ever do, then we will have Stanley Kubrick to thank. He put himself at some great risk to reveal this message to us, and I think we should appreciate that about him. He evidently really wanted to reveal this truth to us, and we should salute him for it. So with that, thank you for your time, and goodbye.